participants. Now, I would like to introduce the first keynote speaker of the day, the Dr. Dale Fleischer. Dale Fleischer is an emeritus professor of accountancy at the University of Mississippi and holder of Roland Sherrill Burns Chair in Accountancy. He received bachelor's and master's degrees from Ball State University and PhD from the University of Cincinnati. He is the author of 52 books in 98 editions. He has authored over 400 articles for more than 100 different journals, including very important journals, the Accounting Review, Issues in Accounting Education, Abacus, Journal of Accountancy, Accounting History Review, and the Accounting Historians Journal. He's a past president of the Academy of Accounting Historians and past editor of its journal. He has been program coordinator and vice president of the American Accounting Association Southeast Region. He is life member of American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, the American Accounting Association, and the Academy of Accounting Historians. In 2011, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants honored Dale with its highest award for educators, the Distinguished Achievement in Accounting Education Award. Now, he will make a talk titled Looking in the Rearview Mirror, the Importance of Accounting History. Now, good morning, Dale Fleischer. You have the floor. Thank you. We cannot hear you, Mr. Fleischer. Could you please open your microphone?
There.
Thank you.
Okay, now can I share my screen?
Yes, you can.
There.
Okay.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I should say good morning, but that's hard for me to do given that it's still last night for me. There's a 9-hour difference in time. And I have many friends in Turkey, and including some who are on this session this morning. What I want to talk about today is basically accounting history. The theme of this conference is the new dynamics of accounting, transformation in theory and practice. But before anyone can transform theory and practice, you have to know where the theory and practice are now and how they got that way. You first need to look in the rearview mirror. What is behind us? We need to be concerned with accounting history before we go looking ahead. By the way, can you see my screen okay? Can anyone tell me if they can see my screen? Well, what are the benefits of accounting history? Well, there is an intellectual advantage in knowing history. The Roman Cato said, "We remain forever ignorant if we ignore the lessons of the past." And students can use accounting history to get a better grasp of the rules of accounting. And an appreciation for history results in a pride in our profession. And if you have a knowledge of causal factors, that results in greater understanding of present methods. And I always think history is very aesthetic. These are the best articles in most accounting journals. And related to this conference, accounting history needs to be at the foundation of any attempts to change. Accounting history is important, and you need to start every research project with where old ideas came from, and you need to teach your students how our current practices and organizations became what they are. My focus today is on the importance of accounting history. everyone doesn't need to be an accounting historian, but everyone does need to read accounting history. What events led to changes in practice? In America, most significant changes in practice have been the result of large frauds or turning point cataclysmic events in the economy. Is that true in other countries? I don't know, but maybe you could tell me. Who, in terms of individuals and organizations, are responsible for past changes? Upon whose shoulders are we standing? Can a knowledge of past changes be used to initiate future changes? And what resources can be used to conduct historical accounting research? Answers to these questions will be explored in this presentation. When I refer to accounting history research, I am referring to the use of primary sources. Primary sources are the original source materials for historical fact. Primary sources are tangible materials that existed at the time the historical event was taking place, and they aid in describing that event. Primary sources include eyewitness accounts, diaries, letters, ledgers, journals, financial statements, photos, wills, business records such as invoices, inventory lists of households, inheritance inventories, tax assessments, and court decisions. And the good thing is, of the ancient documents that have survived, the vast majority of them are accounting artifacts. So we've got a lot of resources upon which to base accounting history. Also say a little about secondary sources as well. Secondary sources are the end products of the study and use of primary materials, but the historians have added their own interpretation. Secondary sources are produced by referring both to primary works and other secondary works. Such things as textbooks, monographs, and journal articles are generally classified as secondary sources. But you need to have a knowledge of secondary evidence, because that can permit the history researcher to concentrate on surprise findings that differ from the secondary sources. But keep in mind, secondary sources could be wrong. Primary sources generally are not wrong. Well, once you're dealing with the primary sources, you have to stop and think about whether those sources have been consciously transmitted or unconsciously transmitted. Consciously transmitted material was designed to be used by future scholars. It includes memoirs, court testimony, published annual reports, and some taped interviews. These could be biased because the person who created them wanted to bias somebody. On the other hand, unconsciously translated material is evidence that is not looking to be judged by posterity. This includes most accounting and other business records. So the thing to keep in mind, most empirical research, as we know it in accounting, is based on public reports, while the hidden reports may tell a more truthful and understandable story. In other words, instead of using financial statements in your research, maybe you should use the trial balances and the actual account books themselves. Okay, once you've got some primary sources, the next thing to look at is the meaning of them. Is the real meaning different from the literal meaning? This is usually not a problem with accounting documents such as journals and ledgers, but it might be with financial statements. Again, a financial statement is sometimes meant to bias the investor. Can the evidence be used with confidence is what you ask in terms of when you're trying to look at the internal criticism of your source. And was the writer in a position to deal with the subject in question? You need to look for the biases of the author. How much time has elapsed since the events? And what was the intent of the author? If you've got a report from somebody, what was he trying to say? And what audience was the subject of the document? And you need to examine corroborative evidence. Is there something to support your conclusion? Now, a simple presentation of evidence is not enough, though, for accounting history. A description of old account books without any attempt to deal with their broader significance is not really a history. The researcher must digest the evidence thoroughly, use the work of other scholars, and venture into some generalization or conclusion. Another thing to consider is implotment. By implotment, I mean from whose view is the history to be written? Each plot is written in a different style and rhetoric, even though the sources may be exactly the same. For example, the example I usually use is with Christopher Columbus, who sailed off to America in 1492 to discover America. How would you write that up? Well, if you're looking at it from Columbus's point of view, it might be about conquering new territory or a discovery of new lands. But if you write it from the viewpoint of the accountant on board his ship, and there was an accountant on board with Columbus, I've seen his picture on the rotunda of the US Capitol building. He wore a big hat. The accountant would write a story about revenues exceeding costs. And we made a profit on this voyage, and everything is good. Now, if you're writing it from the viewpoint of the priest on board, his story would be more about converting the heathens. And let us not forget the Arawak Indians who were already here in America. If you write it from their point of view, they're going to write about the plague that Columbus brought with him, the theft of the Indians' assets, and the murder of their tribal members and the kidnapping of others. So you've got one set of facts, you've got four different stories depending on the plot. And so you need to do that with your writing. Who are you writing from the viewpoint of? Are you writing from a member of the Financial Accounting Standards Board, an accounting setting body? Or are you really writing from the viewpoint of the user of the financial statements or user of those new rules that the Standards Board is creating? Okay, what do you want to look for if you're doing accounting history research? Well, one thing, look for the influence of the environment and changes in societal needs on accounting. Again, that follows the theme of this conference. Are we going to have changes in the future? Well, do we need changes in the future? We need to look for something that differs from current use or that differs from country to country. Then explain why the environment of the time caused the difference. I think of one I did on barter accounting once. I read where barter accounting ceased to exist in America in about 1850. Well, then I found a ledger from 1910 that was totally devoted to barter accounting. Well, why? Well, the environment of this 1910 place was one of poverty. They had no money. They had no hard currency. Therefore, all their records were in terms of barter goods. And you can look for diffusion of accounting innovations. If you've got a change, how does it diffuse from the eastern side of the country to the western side of the country? How does it diffuse to other countries? Also, look for the effects of accounting changes on the environment. Does it work that way? Example here is with pensions and post-retirement benefits in the USA. Until recent years, these costs, pensions and post-retirement benefits, were not recorded as liabilities by US companies. So we promise someone we'll pay them a pension in 30 years, but nobody recorded a liability. Well, of course, the standard setters say, well, that's not right. There needs to be a rule that pensions and post-retirement benefits should be recorded as liabilities. So they passed a standard to that effect. Well, what did that do to the businesses? The businesses that were paying out pensions and post-retirement benefits, just recording them on a cash basis, they solved the problem easily. They quit paying pensions. They quit paying post-retirement benefits. So this new accounting rule that said you have to record these as liabilities served to end that type of employee benefit. It changed retirement in America. And number 4, here's just the opposite point of view. Look for the causes of accounting changes. What are the pivotal factors precipitating change? One hypothesis is that accounting practice changes only as a result of a strong external pressure, such as a stock market crash, high inflation, or maybe a major scandal. Big frauds lead to changes in accounting. Other things you can do is oral and video histories, which is the SEC Historical Society has done of this. So if you're interested in regulatory accounting in the United States, you can go to the SEC Historical Society website. I'd say development of large accounting firms is a good topic to work on. But when I say large, I probably should include small as well too. If it's accounting firms been around for a while, maybe there needs to be a history written of it. Also another one, development of academic accounting in a certain location, either in your country or state, or even at your local school. I just recently finished a 400-page book on the history of accounting at my school, the University of Mississippi. It's also called Ole Miss. Similar histories exist for the University of London, the University of Illinois, and probably many more that I'm unfamiliar with. But once you've got the school histories, they can then be combined into state or country histories. Biographies, I think, are a great thing we need to be working on. I'll say more about that later. Also, something that tells a story, which is sometimes called micro histories. And if you just want a publication, something related to events and jubilees usually is a good opportunity for you. Micro histories examine isolated subjects such as a small business or a local accounting firm to learn about the larger universe. Microhistories view people not as a group, but as individuals who should not be lost in anonymous crowds. Such projects make for a good story, if nothing else. Microhistories focus on the margins of power and less on the center points of history. And these document the history of everyday life, such as a single obscure accountant, provides a view of inconsistencies in the cultural and social systems. So again, it's another way of seeing what's happening, but not necessarily by the majority. As I mentioned, events accounting is an area where it's sometimes an easy way to get a publication. Look for something, a jubilee celebration or a centennial or a bicentennial. For example, in 1976, the United States celebrated its bicentennial. Well, basically, every accounting journal wanted to have an article on the bicentennial, something they could relate to the bicentennial. So if you could write an article about accounting in 1776, you've probably got it published pretty easily. You can also relate your research to major anniversaries of organizations or journals. I myself wrote one on the 75th anniversary of the American Accounting Association. I just recently, last year, with Annette Pridgeon, wrote a history of the Mississippi Society of CPA's 100th anniversary. I've done one for AACSB International, the accreditation agency, for its 90th anniversary. The CPA exam 100th anniversary, Gary Kravitz and Paul Moranti and I wrote a major article, and we also did a videotape on the CPA exam 100th centennial. A lot of people have written on tax law anniversaries. Also in this category, you might have anniversaries of well-recognized authors. If you've got an accounting author who was born 100 years ago, a journal might be willing to publish that, and, as a sort of a celebratory article, if you would write a history of that person's writings. Of course, that involves knowing how they drew their inspiration and ideas, where the ideas were original or not. And that leads us kind of to the next subject of biography. And a biographer is sort of a metaphoric portrait painter. You want to paint a picture of the person for all to see. And the idea is that a life put on record is inspiration to others. That's why we're writing about these old people. We want to inspire the future people. And biography, from my point of view, is an area of accounting history that is worthy of research. The Academy of Accounting Historians gives an award each year to the best book or article in the area of biography. And I was honored to win that award in 2005, and then my wife Tanya won it 10 years later. In recent years, it's been won by several Europeans have won in recent years. And the reason biography is so important is because history is really the story of individuals. Great nations rise and fall because of human decisions. It's the human we need to be writing about. And this was an early accounting history buff in New York, Norman Webster. He said that every lasting institution is the lengthened shadow of a person. Now, I think he was talking about the New York Society of CPAs at the time, but he was big on biography because it's people that make you. You can't say, well, the AICPA did this. Well, it wasn't the AICPA, it was some person at the AICPA or some person who used the AICPA's influence to get something accomplished. And as you're doing it, you might remember biographies cannot be only, don't always have to be just the great people, the good people. Bad people have made contributions as well. Again, my wife Tanya and I had an article in the Accounting Review in 1986 on the contributions of Ivar Kruger to American accounting practice. Now, Ivar Kruger, you may be aware, was, I believe, a Swedish gentleman who was the biggest fraud in history in the 1920s and 1930s. But yet that Swedish criminal made accounting better in America. Now, if you're doing biographical research, you run into one of two problems, either a lack of material or an abundance of material. Of course, you can see the problem with a lack of material. Well, you don't have anything to write about. But with an abundance of material, it could be even worse because you don't know where to start. There's so much there and so many pages to turn. It's demoralizing sometimes to not know what's important and what's not. common example given here with the abundance of material is American Pulitzer Prize winning biographer Robert Caro. Caro has spent the past 50 years writing biographies of two people, one of which was President Lyndon Johnson in the United States. And Johnson left an abundance of material, so it has taken Robert Caro 50 years to turn every page. He's worked full time for 50 years on this biography of Lyndon Johnson. Now, what are your data sources? Well, sometimes if you're writing a biography, you've got the person who's written something. You've got their published works you can look at. You can contrast their later works with their earlier works. Sometimes you'll find some unpublished manuscripts, sometimes unfinished. You want to find out what are the recollections of friends, families, and co-workers, if they're, if any of those are still living. You may find letters and diaries by the person, and you can find these in WorldCat. WorldCat tells us a library has these, but also check eBay. Sometimes you can buy old letters of famous individuals, even famous accountants, on eBay. Sometimes the people of your subject may have written an autobiography, usually unpublished, but they've written it. And that's a great source of information for you. But remember, an autobiography represents the life the subject remembers as opposed to the life they actually lived. And of course, your sources are frail and will often crumble in your hands. Handwritten sources are difficult to read, so as a result, you've got to have an unswerving curiosity to even do biographical research. Let me throw in a plug here for the Ole Miss Library. When you're researching published sources in accounting history, one of the best places to turn to, wherever you live, is the University of Mississippi Library. The University of Mississippi houses the largest accounting library in the world. We are actually about 3 times bigger than the second largest library in the world. And we have digitized literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of pages of accounting related material. So, and by the way, all of you can access the Ole Miss Library at any time from your home computer. There's no charge. There's no passwords needed. Think of the University of Mississippi Library as your personal research database. Another source to look for is Accountants Index. If you're dealing with anything published in English, then the Accountants Index probably has cataloged it during the year, about the century prior to 1991. Those pages now are digitized at the university, on the university's website. We also have published or digitized Deloitte's publications. Anything ever published by Deloitte is on the Ole Miss website, supposedly. Of course, if you're doing biographical research, you might want to look at obituaries. And we usually think of newspapers when we talk about obituaries, but look in accounting journals too. They often had obituaries of famous accountants. Most major newspapers have indexes going back. New York Times index goes back to 1851. Then you'll find there are various biography indexes, various types of who's who. There are accounting hall of fames in several nations. Early accounting associations usually publish yearbooks. For example, the AICPA published through 1947 that listed every member of the organization and sometimes told more about them. And then there are some subscription services that are excellent. For example, newspapers.com and ancestry.com. I use those almost every day do accounting research. Those just great sources, whether you're talking biography research or any other type of accounting history research, newspapers.com and ancestry.com. I don't know, you may not recognize the term newspapers.com. I think that goes under other names in Europe. But ancestry.com is probably ancestry.com because I'm all the time getting advertisements saying, do I want to subscribe to the Great Britain version or the German version or the Italian version of ancestry.com in case I have ancestors in any of those countries. Again, if you're looking up this famous individual, what happened to their personal papers? Well, sometimes the library archives will have them, and you can find that in WorldCat. Now, one problem is that business archives are often decentralized. For example, I found a journal for a single year of a cotton plantation in early 1800s Mississippi. This was in our library here at Ole Miss, Cotton Plantation Journal. And I thought, well, that's great, but 1 year is not really enough. I'd like to have all their journals over the years. Well, I kept working on it. I found, well, the State Library and Archives in Jackson, Mississippi had one. The Louisiana State Library had one in Baton Rouge. The University of Virginia in Richmond, Virginia, the Virginia State Archives had another one. So here we had a small cotton plantation in Mississippi, but its ledgers and journals were spread out all over the southern part of the United States. Also, companies may have personnel files that you can get access to. I mentioned I had written a history of the accounting program at Ole Miss. Well, I was interested in one of the first faculty member to have a PhD, which was hired in 1937. I went to the personnel office and asked, could I see his personnel file? And I explained what I was doing. They said, okay, but that's stored upstairs in the attic. You'll have to come back tomorrow. Of course, I thought that was great because I didn't think they'd give me anything. And so they did. The next day I got it, and it had the letter of offering him the job in 1937. It told what his salary was going to be. I mean, all his personnel files were there. And I've had other academic friends tell me the same thing, that they had been able to go to a personnel or human resources department and get files on people they were looking for. Again, ancestry.com is a very valuable source in that you can find almost anything. One person I looked up once on here was R. Emmett Taylor. Now that may be someone you probably never heard of, but your next speaker may have heard of him, because R. Emmett Taylor was a biographer of Pacioli. And in his 1941 book, he put in a lot of things that nobody else had ever heard of before. And so everyone questioned in 1941, where do you find all this stuff about Pacioli that has never been published anywhere else? Well, I went to ancestry.com just to look him up, and I discovered that I found such things as ship manifests and passport applications that showed that he had gone to Genoa, Italy every summer through the 1930s, apparently studying Pacioli in Italy. Also, I don't know if you have Freedom of Information Act or not, but in the United States, we have a Freedom of Information Act, which allows us to access records in government agencies. Of course, you always have to do interviews, but interviews are not always reliable because if somebody likes your subject, he'll say only good things about him. And if they don't like your subject, then they'll say only bad things about it. So you always need to corroborate your findings from interviews. As I mentioned earlier, the SEC Historical Society has several interviews of famous regulators on their website, but always reviews with skepticism. One thing to keep in mind, avoid present-mindedness. Present-mindedness. That's the temptation to couch the subject's decisions and deliberations based on your knowledge of the future. Remember, the subject doesn't yet know about the future when they're doing it. So you can't blame them for what they did because you know it didn't work. But keep in mind too, a biography is not just a collection of facts. You should have a theme and a plot, and you should stage the events in the subject life in an interesting manner without changing the historical accuracy. Also, graduate assistants can rarely be used. You know, to write a biography, you sort of need to walk in the subject's shoes. Well, if the grad assistant's the one who's walking in his shoes, then you can't write it up very well. So usually biographers are more or less lone wolf researchers. Also, you have to do due diligence for gaps in the subject's life. The example I give here usually is with respect to a British biographer of a minor British poet. And he had written this, this is just a few years ago, and he'd written this biography, and he said he knew that the subject poet was working and living in a certain place in 1926. He was still living there doing the same thing in 1929. He really didn't have anything on 1927 and 1928, but he didn't seem like anything happened then. Well, after the publisher advertised the books coming out, he received a letter from somebody in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So now remember, this is a British author. And the Philadelphia woman says, oh, she's looking forward to this wonderful book because she wants to read about her grandmother. Said her grandmother was engaged to the poet in 1927 and 28 when the poet was living in Philadelphia. And the poet had written her 75 letters with poems in them that all were unpublished and everything. Well, the biographer was totally stunned. He never knew that the poet had ever left Britain, let alone lived in Philadelphia. He thought he'd never been married, but yet here's an engagement. So he immediately flew to Philadelphia. He found out that he just didn't know about it. The woman knew what she was talking about. So it was too late to get the British version of the book changed, but he did get the American version changed. So to summarize biography, the great lesson of biography is show what people can do. A life put on record acts as an inspiration to others. And the biography as a type of accounting history is worthy of research effort, which I say, and the Academy of Accounting Historians agrees. In shaping a biography, the writer has the responsibility of portraying a person for posterity. So it's a big responsibility. As I near my conclusion here, let me point out something President Woodrow Wilson stated was that the study of history develops the invaluable mental power which we call judgment. The reader of history can read about new concepts with a critical eye because he or she has a historical context in which to place the new concepts and is able to resist indoctrination and propaganda. History enables the independent mind to criticize the attitudes that misread the present from ignorance of the past. And in conclusion, we need the substance of accounting history. We need the historical thinking that informs rational judgments. So Why study accounting history? To gain the habits of mind and the intellectual tools that are required to be a free thinker. Yes, accounting will be different in the future, probably much broader based than it is today. But it will also be better if the lessons of the past are incorporated into the process of change. And at that point, I will conclude. And how do I get out of this?
Thank you very much, Professor Fleischer, for your presentation. So I think Batuhan Hoca has a question.
Thank you, dear host. Dear Dale, it's nice to see you once again. And,
hello.
And you are hearing me, nice. Yes, it's nice to see you once again, even that we are online right now. I think that's, as Turkish accounting historians, we are rich in accounting history materials, and these materials make it very easy for young Turkish historians to publish internationally. And also, right now, you have opened us new horizons for us, I think, because you showed us new methods, and also you showed us resources. So, as for me, I will keep these resources aside, and I thank you for that.
Well, I should have mentioned when I was talking about the Ole Miss Library, if you do a search on the Ole Miss Library website, I did a search for your father, and he came up 52 times that his name was mentioned on the Ole Miss website. So again, the Ole Miss website is very much American oriented. I think my name came up 750 times, but your father came up 52 times.
It's nice to hear that. Thank you. I have a question for you now.
Okay.
We are in possession of old accounting books. These books vary from the late 13th century to the early 19th century and the late 19th century. The late 19th century were the first specimens of the double entry bookkeeping in Turkey.
Okay.
And so what would your advice be to accounting historians who want to create articles from books? What methodology should they benefit from if they want to study on one book or several books?
I think it can be whatever you want. I can think of one case where I wrote an article or co-authored an article about just a single book. And so that was, if it's something that's kind of different, then the one book by itself is probably good. Or if you can group some together, perhaps only by year, perhaps by author, that would work as well. So the opportunities are great for something like that.
So I will search for your book for an example then.
For an article.
For your paper.
My article was on a French book. I think it was something about a French accounting book in the Republic, I think, or something like that.
An example on that methodology would be better, so I will search for the paper.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Güvenli, for your question. Is there any other questions? Professor Fleischer? I think there isn't. Thank you very much, Professor Fleischer, for attending us. It was a pleasure for us to listen to you here. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Without a break, our conference program will continue with the video presented by Professor Melih Erdoğan titled To-Do List, Learn the Multiplication of Roots from